That's a bad way to come into the video right there.
Sons of Liberty.
Candy, I mean, it's one of those things where Americans, we have a huge problem because you've heard socialism, communism, Marxism all used interchangeably, that when you get into like poli-sci, there's really hard delineations.
Yeah.
For Americans, Marxism could range all the way from like really truly being communist to just not being friendly enough with America to make us happy, and we want to replace you with a leader who will be more friendly with us. So, it's a wide range. Hi.
It's like people who aren't Christian, Catholic, Christian denominations, like they're all Christian. No, there's Lutheran, Christian, there's literally saints, Mormons.
So you're going to do your final exam for this course on Monday.
Wait, so what are we doing on the last day of school then? In that 90 minutes?
Do you notice how I put like a comma? I was like right ready to just move on. So what we'll do afterwards is we'll have a series of activities, tests, and those sorts of things on current issue stuff. But as far as having your content down for a final, we need it for before your AP test. So there'll be other tests afterwards. It just won't be the weighted final grade that you're getting there that shows what preparation you've done for the AP test.
Are we gonna play this country game then?
The country game again.
The war. The war, yeah.
What?
I know,
I just lost all the records for it.
I want to watch Forrest Gump.
I have all the records.
Oh, she got you on that one. Yeah, no, that'll be my.
How do you
I
do
still don't want to do it.
How do you lose those records?
So we're back to Cape Cambridge.
And that's how I feel about homework.
We should watch it like that.
So yours was like, your question was just a gateway to get to Cape Cambridge.
A little bit.
It's like a gateway
But
question.
I have this great question already, and the World War II American Rebel. Also on, or this American one in the Industrial Revolution. They're making like history movies. They're actually really good.
Hey Rachel.
He's not listening.
Hey Rachel. Hey Rachel. You keep trying to convince me about how historically accurate the Cape Cambridge movies are. I totally agree. And I've never seen them. I just trust you. I just trust you implicitly. Now, here's the thing. I'm just not feeling it from my classroom.
Why not?
But no, I just don't even need to say why not. I just don't. I'm not. What?
Are you just like against childhood?
What? Yeah, I can tell. That's why I chose this job. It was a bad move, but what can you do? I mean, yeah, anti-children. Go ahead.
Could we watch? Oh wait, so we're doing on Monday. We're doing another just AP multiple choice test.
Yes, you walk into class, you're taking the test. Cool.
So yeah, I got that. And then so that the rest of the time we're just doing current event stuff.
After the AP test, we're going to be doing a deeper dive in your history, where we're going to skirt like Clinton, Bush, Obama, Clinton, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama. We're going to skirt that. We're going to do like safety stuff that you guys need to get you through the test. We're going to do a much deeper dive with that, especially with current issues. Like right now, we just had a secret meeting over at the Senate where they brought all 100 senators to the White House to explain to them what's going on with Korea. And it feels like we're getting onto a war footing right now. We're going to take some time to kind of break stuff like that apart.
You know, they have this small, almost perfect circle. Just like you.
Excuse me, guys. So if you have any other questions, I'll take them, but just, it's kind of hard to try to talk over like all the side conversations. Go ahead.
Do you have a period attack that's on my head?
Yeah, it should be inside the APUSH handouts, the one that's looking kind of broken down. There is not one left.
There is one with a blue sheet.
History roll.
Kim Jong-un. They threatened to nuke us like multiple times.
I'll make a point. All right. Let's get started. Do you have any questions or problems or anything that we need to deal with before we get started today with either period 8 or anything else with your AP review before we get going? about?
Genesis from that history.
Correct.
Okay, can you explain to specifically this group, the silver movement?
Sure.
Oh, I asked him about that. Okay, going from like the Farmers Alliance forward.
Yep.
No, that's 160.
Like 5
That'll be easy. So with the silver movement, the way that we want to look at the silver movement is with the idea that from the time of the market revolution, farmers had always been kind of on a balance of making enough money to be able to make a go out of things. If you were a large-scale farmer, it was easier than if you were a small-scale farmer. Where'd that go? Is it?
It's not pulled up, I guess.
Oh, it's still working. And so in the late 1800s, there was laissez-faire, hands-off business, deregulation. That's like right up with me against my book. All right.
Be a nice highlight.
Sweet.
Never see him recalibrate that part.
Right. They might do. So with silver, what we had in the late 1800s, you have farmers who are engaged in a market revolution, and they're allowed to expand outwards because of trains. Because they have trains that are bringing stuff back and forth, they can now produce more food, which produce more wealth, but also the railroads are going to be going through this expansionistic cycle, and at times they're going to need to start squeezing farmers to make as much money as they can out of their railroads, especially when the economy takes dips. For the railroads also, they discover that if you've got a train this long, they figure out the efficiency. Like if you've ever flown on a plane and you notice how packed tight it is lately, where they pack them all in, they try to have mass capacity on their planes on a daily basis. But then the problem is when you get to a holiday, they have the same capacity of planes, more people want to fly, prices then go through the roof because there's just the same number of seats but more people competing for them. That's what the farmers run into. And so the farmers start getting mad in the late 1800s because in the fall, more of them are harvesting food and they're all competing for the same spots on trains, so the price of trains goes up. For the railroads, for the farmers also, because they're mass producing, their prices are going down because the supply is too high. And so the farmers are discovering, they're in the panic of 1873 and 93 especially, and a little bit in the panic of 1883, when the economy dips, people stop buying stuff. When people stop buying stuff, prices drop, and the farmers who had already seen their prices drop a ton were in deep trouble. And so when we see this drop, we call that deflation, where the money supply is shrinking. And remember, for the farmers, their biggest problems was mortgages and loans. And so when we went through silver way back when, the problem with the farmers is they're going to watch their prices dip, mortgages stay the same, so it becomes harder and harder for them to pay their loans, and everybody's then going to start mass producing food, which causes prices to drop even more. And so the hope that they have is right now, with deflation, is happening with gold. Gold makes our money supply inelastic, so you only get to put out the amount of money that you have in gold, which means if everybody's competing for the same pieces of gold, it's becoming more and more scarce, it's becoming worth more. And so the farmers want to add as much silver as they can to the money supply to make prices go up. It's going to take more money to buy food, which should hopefully make prices go up in the future. The problem that they had was that they pegged silver to a 16-to-1 ratio. It was just kind of this historical number that they picked out where it would take 16 pieces of silver to equal 1 piece of gold, and that's what they put into the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. In the late 1800s, though, we aren't discovering any gold, but they described something for you called the Comstock Lode and other hits, where they start discovering more and more silver, and so this ratio gets out of whack, and it actually starts ending up being like 32 pieces of silver should actually equal 1 piece of gold. So when we got to Cleveland in the panic of 1893, you learned about people cashing in 16 pieces of silver to take out 1 piece of gold. This almost made us bankrupt because we lost all of our gold, and we had to ask J.P. Morgan for a loan to help us out. Cleveland did what was smart, got rid of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, but that then convinced farmers that he was in a conspiracy with rich people to make them sad, and so they instead ran William James Bryan promised to take every chunk of silver and stamp it into money. And thankfully he would have been elected. That would have been really crazy. Sure. So with farmers, silver could serve as an inflationary thing. During the Civil War, Abe Lincoln had used greenbacks because we needed paper money since there wasn't enough gold to fulfill all of his purchasing. So when he would buy stuff from northern factories, he couldn't just say, hey, I'll get you later. He would print up these greenbacks were almost like promissory notes where later you could trade them in for gold. But by printing off so many of these, he's going to then inflate the money supply. Prices will start going up, and that'll help out farmers accidentally. Totally. And so when you get to the farmers are going to want both this and this. They like both of them. Initially greenbacks at first, and then what happens is people like J.P. Morgan and other northern business people will put together an effort to be anti-greenback, and so then the farmers will then say, if you don't want us to be using paper, if that's the issue, we can use specie, but we're not finding any gold, so let's go with silver. And then at the end of this period, during McKinley's presidency, that's when we have the Yukon gold strike, and that fixes everything. We inflate our money supply just using gold. Any other questions? Go ahead.
So with the first bus and then the charter engine,
Yeah.
how did they manage to like get a second bus? Like it was with the charter,
Uh-huh.
right? Okay, can you just like explain that?
Yeah.
And the recreation of it?
And you're good with the other Hamilton parts of this plan, just not the charter. Is that the thing?
Yeah, like, I understand the fire assumptions and like all that, but just kind of the transition from the end of the first bus's charter to the creation of the second bus.
So in 1791, the bus is created, and it's a pretty radical idea that you're going to be blending together a public-private institution that's going to handle all of our finances, collecting all of our taxes. So since it's seen as a pretty radical idea, it's only given a 20-year charter, and then it's going to come to an end in 1811. And what we pointed out when we were talking about this way back when, this idea was a Hamilton idea. Thank you. Started during the time of George Washington, and George Washington and Adams thought it was a pretty good idea. But then when we got past 1801, Jefferson was president 1801 to 1809, and we use this as an example of his pragmatism, where he was a strict constructionist until he became president, and then he didn't kill the bus immediately like Jackson did. He allowed it to run through, and then they allowed it to end during James Madison's presidency, right before the War of 1812. When Madison allowed it to end, he didn't really think it was that big of a deal, but he hadn't really thought through the issues that he was going to run into, because you have to fund a war, collect taxes, pay money, make payments, do bonds and that sort of stuff. And so your big turning point here is the War of 1812. Because that's going to bring to everybody's attention the fact that the bus had a really important role to play, and it wasn't there. And so during the War of 1812, we don't have the money to fight a war. We fail in our invasion of Canada. We come really desperately close to having things fall apart when DC gets burned down. And so our second bus is going to be put in 1816. They're going to figure out ways to fudge their way through the War of 1812. And this bus is going to carry us through 1836. So it's given another 20-year charter. James Madison essentially creates a brand new one like the old one. The problem with the charter process is nobody in 1816 has any idea that Andrew Jackson is going to become president of the United States. So in the War of 1812, he's the hero of New Orleans, but nobody's really picking up on the idea that he's going to eventually become president. Nobody knows what his ideas are on the bus, but he intensely hates this thing. So he loses the election of 1824, your corrupt bargain, where John Quincy Adams and Clay win that election. And so we're going to have Andrew Jackson becoming president in 1828, actually coming in 29. And so that means that he is going to be finished up in 1836. And what has Clay really nervous is if the bus is coming to an end at the same time that Jackson is finishing being president, he actually is going to be president until the following year. So he will be president until January. He could do to the bus what John Adams did with the Midnight Judges and just do a bunch of stuff and then have it fall apart. So when we learned about this in class, Henry Clay is the guy who runs against Jackson in 1832. And we spent a lot of time talking about like Nicholas Biddle and the plan to hold on to the bus. And so there's an attempt to recharter the bus right here with the idea that Henry Clay could then make the bus an issue. And he believed that when he put it out to the American people, it was part of his American system. He thought this would win him the election. Instead, he gets destroyed.
And then that's part of the bank board, right?
Yeah.
That leads to this.
Yeah, so Jackson will veto the bus in 1832, crush Clay, take all the money out and put it into his pet banks, and then right here is when he creates his specie circular where he announces to everybody, if you want to buy government land, you're going to need to pay actual gold or silver for it.
Yeah, and that led to like sort of a depression, right?
Yeah.
Within time, or yeah, Canada.
Your panic of 1837 that ends up destroying Van Buren.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense now, thank you.
Of course. Go ahead.
So, this is kind of off topic.
Sure.
Can you explain, so it's not holding company trust, not monopoly. So I understand monopolies, I understand how that all works, but I don't understand how going from monopolies to trust. And then, yeah.
What's that? They're confusing. I just fixed that. So here's your monopoly owner with his nefarious mustache. And again, whenever you see a cartoon in your AP test that has like an octopus like this, it's meant to show Rockefeller. It's talking about monopolies or trusts. So the way the monopoly works is you've got one person owning all the businesses in a certain field. You could have vertical or horizontal monopolies. So horizontal monopolies is owning all the businesses that do the same thing. Vertical means you own all the businesses that make the product you're selling from beginning to end. So like Carnegie with steel is a vertical monopoly. What Rockefeller's going to do is he's going to create a trust. And what the trust is going to do is it's going to try to bypass anti-monopoly laws. So we're going to draw a line right through here. And he's going to create the Standard Oil Trust, and he's going to give that company ownership over all of his businesses, and he's going to be the main owner of that one company. Does that make sense? So it's still monopolistic, but according to the law, it's not technically a monopoly, it's a trust. The trust company owns all of these businesses.
And he just owns that trust company.
And he owns that trust company, but he's going to make it more complicated. He's going to have a board of directors. So they are also part owners. He's going to sell stock, which means there's all sorts of other people who are part owners around the country. So he's going to make the situation very murky. So when you try to apply a monopoly law to him, he'll be able to say, I'm not technically one of those. And people in Congress are writing laws for him because this is the Gilded Age. So they're going to make sure the laws are equally vague, like the Sherman Antitrust Act, so he doesn't get busted. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so holding companies next. The way a
Or you
hold...
can just start this, because,
What?
you should just start this, actually, I'll just take that.
Okay, so it's going to take like 2 seconds, it'll be fine. So the way a holding company works is we learned about like Munn versus Illinois and the Wabash cases where some states start dabbling in the idea of if the federal government won't step in and regulate, maybe the states should. And so what people start looking for is states, and the most notorious place is going to be New Jersey, where you take your business and instead of having it headquartered, like he lived in the Ohio, Pennsylvania area, instead you create your standard trust here in New Jersey. So you're moving this over here. So this is kind of a dummy headquarters where you're doing your business in a state that doesn't believe in regulation. So even if the state that you're in, like Ohio, decides to start regulating, your holding company is technically in New Jersey that doesn't believe in regulations, and so you're safe from the states regulating you. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's all these sneaky back ways that are trying to avoid being busted up, who's eventually going to bust them up like crazy in spite of that crap? Yeah, so Roosevelt's just going to start whatever. All right, so any other questions? Okay, I just got told by Melissa, so I need to get rolling. Put me in my place to make sure I need to. Yeah, totally. It's totally something I need, by the way. So I'm glad you did that. Max, she's going to yell at me. What do you need?
Can you explain Jay's and Peyton's treaty?
All right, no, I'm just kidding. Jay's treaty is going to be Jay's treaty is going to be a treaty during the Washington presidency where Alexander Hamilton is going to influence the negotiations that are being done by the Chief Justice John Jay. So we're trying to get a good deal from England, and essentially they give us nothing. We give England a whole bunch of stuff that they like. When this treaty is done, a lot of Americans go bonkers, but Washington says, look, this is my treaty, this is the best we could do, and he essentially says, if you don't like this treaty, you don't like me. So a lot of Americans are upset. It ends up tearing the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists apart, so they're having trouble with each other. But Pinckney's treaty, or the Treaty of San Lorenzo, comes right afterwards, where the Spanish have been doing things like during the Articles, they shut down our ability to use the Mississippi River in New Orleans, and they started putting pressure us in the southern part of the United States. Pinckney's treaty is a treaty where the Spanish don't understand what we're up to with Jay's treaty. They think we're tight with England, and so they open up the Mississippi River to trade. They give us a chunk of Florida because they're confused. They think that we're now tight with the British, but we're not. And we totally allow them to think that we are. Any other questions? Sweet. So let's get rolling with period 8. Period 8, 1945 to 1980. This is World War II to the election of Ronald Reagan. We should be able to do this pretty quickly because of the fact that this is all recent material, but I'll highlight for you things. I'll highlight for you the message. You just dismissed me like we're not going to do this thing. So anyway,
That's what you always say.
I'm trying. All right, so anyway. Period 8.1. We're going to be taking a look at Cold War. And so like it mentions up here, we're moving into an uncertain and unstable post-war world by establishing and maintaining a position of global leadership. So especially when you look at this paragraph right here, this concept is inviting you to compare and contrast with post-World War I. Post-World War I is isolationism. Post-World War II is Cold War and interventionism. Mentions here that we're going to enter into a Cold War with the authoritarian Soviet Union, where they gravitate towards being a dictatorship. This is where you'll want to think about the terms like Iron Curtain, where the Soviet Union is going to take over the Eastern European states. So we're going to try to stop the spread of communist military power and influence, create a free market global economy, and build an international security system. And so let's run through each of those. This section right here is dealing with the idea of Cold War foreign policy. So this is the Truman Doctrine. Truman Doctrine is about containment. And especially it's being done in Greece and Turkey to begin with to stop the spread of communism in those places, and that becomes the tone that we have going in the future. When you think about Vietnam and the amount of time we spent on that, I want you to think about the fact that from this time forward, we are anti-communist. Republicans, that's going to be their default after the Red Scares, and you see them naturally go into that during the 1940s and 50s. For the Democrats, they need to prove to Americans that they're anti-communist, and that forces us into some pretty bad conflicts like Korea with Harry Truman trying to prove he's not soft on communism, or Vietnam with LBJ trying to prove that he's not soft on communism. So we end up being drawn in by this idea of the Truman Doctrine. We're going to be getting into the idea of collective security. This is your UN and NATO. Collective security means working together to maintain peace rather than working alone. International aid is your Marshall Plan, and also the Truman Doctrine, where we're sending out aid to other places. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then economic institutions. There's two different types of economic institutions that I want to be noticing. Number one, I would like you to notice the Marshall Plan, because that's economically us bolstering European countries so that they don't go the wrong direction. A second one that might show up on the AP test, although I'll be stunned if they do it because it's so in the weeds. They mentioned to you during the 1940s, post-World War II, the Bretton Woods Conference, where America went off to England and discussed with them and other countries a plan to stabilize the currency around the world and set like exchange ratios and that sort of stuff. And we also cemented the idea that we would stick with the gold standard for the time being. The Bretton Woods Conference is also going to help to create the International Monetary Fund, and that's going to allow us to be involved in other finances around the world. We still have it nowadays. It's called the IMF. Bretton Woods Conference is going to come to an end, though, during Richard Nixon's time. So tomorrow, when we're talking about stagflation, we're going to talk about Nixon pulling us off the gold standard. We then pull out of Bretton Woods. Our currency has been unpinned compared to the rest of the world, and now it just fluctuates. We don't have an official deal for what our dollar equivalency will be. But that's what they're talking about when they talk about economic institutions. They're trying to figure out stability after World War II, so they don't have some economies like England, France, Germany before World War II going off the rails in severe depression because of currency things, especially because of the Germans who just printed up cash after World War I and stuff.
Are we, is the rest of the world still on the gold standard currently?
It depends who's, I mean, they'll say officially that they have some sort of gold standard. And we still have oodles of gold sitting in like places around the country, like Federal Reserves and whatever.
Yeah.
But most countries have come off of it because it's so binding. There's no elasticity to it, so if the economy crashes, everybody starts hoarding gold and suddenly your economy crashes out. So most countries have gone to fiat currency like ours where the money just has value because we say it does.
Right.
Okay, so next section. We're concerned about communist ideology and repression, and so the United States sought to contain communism. That's containment. And they're just asking you to think about the different measures they used. So think about the different strategies that we're up to. We had like the Berlin airlift, Truman Doctrine with Iran and Egypt, Turkey. Sorry, Truman Doctrine with Greece and Turkey. We had the Eisenhower Doctrine, dealing with the idea that it's our job to protect oil reserves in the Middle East. And that brings us into places like Iran, Egypt, and other sorts of places in the Middle East. We also have Korea and Vietnam that obviously are foreign entanglements that America gets into. And we're also spying like crazy. So remember the U-2 spy planes, the Corona program to be able to fly over them in our satellites. And then they're trying to do the same to us. For letter C, Cold War fluctuated between periods of direct aid and military confrontation and periods of mutual coexistence or détente. So the first one, we went through periods of military intervention or aggressiveness. The term you'd want to use is brinksmanship. Brinksmanship is just pushing each other to the brink of war, like playing a gigantic game of chicken, and then seeing who will back down first, and that was your Cuban Missile Crisis. For many people, there was an agreement after the Cuban Missile Crisis that we went too far, so we have the strategic arms limitation treaties that comes to and afterwards. SALT is their nickname. We have the test ban treaty, nuclear test ban treaty, where we stopped testing nukes above ground. But this idea of détente, that's a Nixon idea, and so when you see that term, that's totally Nixonian. Tomorrow we're going to be taking a look at his execution of the Cold War, and what Nixon does is he realizes when he's trying to end the Vietnam War, he's really good with foreign policy, no matter what we make about Watergate and Tricky Dick. He understood that he could turn China and Russia and North Vietnam against each other. So in the middle of his peace negotiations in 1972, he's going to fly to China, even though nobody thought he would because he used to be the head of the HUAC way back when and very anti-communist. He flies off to China, has a great time, and what he does is he plants the seed in North Vietnam's head, wondering what is he doing in China, especially since we have way more to offer to China than North Vietnam does. Then he flies to Russia, does the same thing, and he plants a seed in China and North Vietnam's heads about what could we be doing with Russia, because we got tons of stuff we could offer them. We start giving them grain and other sorts of trade when we never used to do that before. Détente is a decreasing of tensions to try to open up opportunities to trade and end this nuclear tension that we have between us. Détente is also meant to try to figure out ways to then create a favorable end to the Vietnam War, because being tough hadn't been doing it. Brinksmanship didn't quite work out with that, so he's trying out a different strategy. Notice this term right here. We're in a decolonization effort. So post-World War II, a lot of the European countries start giving up the colonies that they had developed from the time of the American colonies all the way through to the early 1900s. But then you see the rise of this nationalistic movement. And remember when I talked to you about the idea in North Vietnam that we go into the war thinking we're bringing democracy, freedom, independence, and the North Vietnamese instead see a European ally in America trying to spread a colonial influence imperialistically into their countries. They have very different feelings about what we're up to. Many countries around the world are going to be labeled as third world countries where they're trying to be independent outside of either the American sphere or the Soviet sphere. And you see America getting involved in their business quite a bit, whether it's the Contras in Nicaragua or it's Iran, where we take out Mossadegh and replace him with the Shah to maintain our access to oil, or Egypt or Iraq or other sorts of places where we try to step in and do that. We have Cold War competition in Latin America, and America is going to be trying to stop the spread of communism or Marxism, that term that we started off with today. And in this box, you can talk about different ways we try to do that. You've already learned about like CIA operations, destabilization, coups, and that sort of stuff. Two ways we use soft power or try to influence people to become our friends. Number one, the Alliance for Progress, JFK's plan to spread economic opportunity to South American and Central American countries. And then remember also the Peace Corps could easily go into that box that we're also used to try to influence other countries to be friendly with us. On your next page, then, we take a look at communism inside the United States. And so we take a look at Cold War policies that bring the debate to what the power of the federal government should be and what is okay with us when we're trying to figure out how to pursue communism. Letter A, we debated policies and methods designed to expose communists and it ended up dividing the countries. So in the 1940s and 50s, conformity is key. This is when we add things like "In God We Trust" onto our money supply and "One Nation Under God" to our pledge to show that we're a Christian nation compared to the godless communists. We have the HUAC and McCarthyism, two attempts to try to root out communists inside the United States. You learned about COINTELPRO today. This is the system used by J. Edgar Hoover to try to infiltrate radical groups that he thought were out of control. You learned about the McCarran Act during Truman's presidency, which was requiring loyalty oaths from people working inside the government to prove that they were not communists, to try to root them out. Now, with this anti-communist foreign policy going on inside of our country, there was very little domestic opposition because it was too dangerous. So for you guys, think about the book like The Crucible, where you have Arthur Miller writing about Puritans because it's too dangerous to talk about how bad McCarthyism is for fear that you're going to be labeled a communist. But then you're going to end up with an anti-war movement that will allow people to talk openly about being anti-communist. So this is from the beatniks, leading into your hippies, students movements, and then obviously anti-war movements that will be able to take you to that point, especially when we get to like the Tet Offensive, Kent State, and those sorts of times that really escalate. Americans are also going to debate whether or not we should have a large nuclear arsenal and the military-industrial complex. When you see that term, remember Eisenhower's admonition. Eisenhower warned in his farewell address, beware the military-industrial complex. His warning in 1960 was that military weapons makers were becoming so influential that they could take us into foreign wars that really weren't important in the United States, but would make them a lot of cash. For a lot of people who like that quote, well, they'll oftentimes make a connection then to Vietnam and how we just had a mindless escalation through the war of throwing more weapons at the conflict and more money as being a proof of what Eisenhower was talking about. There's also the question about the appropriate power of the executive branch in foreign policy. So remember, when Lyndon Johnson got the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through, he essentially got a blank check from Congress, and he was allowed to run the war with very little supervision. So was Nixon, and Nixon, when he had that power, expanded the war into Cambodia and bombing campaigns on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So after the war, the thing that you want to put here is this is where our War Powers Act is going to come from. Congress is going to step in and create a law that puts limitations on what the president can do during wartime. Our problem, though, is that that law has never been enforced, and so even though it's there, each president since that time has stretched it to find out how far they can still go with their military. Hey, Josh.
The large nuclear arsenal, which was like, wasn't Eisenhower said that we should have massive amount of Air Force and then massive amount of nukes and then less ground troops.
Correct. And then JFK is going to bring in his idea of flexible response, where we maintain the big Air Force with our nuclear arsenal, but then add in conventional army and also special forces. Your next section that you have down here, you have ideological, military, and economic concerns are going to shape issues in the Middle East, and we're going to have several oil crises that are going to cause problems inside of our country. So notice, first of all, we've been talking about the Middle East quite a bit. Israel is key to this question. Following World War II, America is going to help what is called a Zionist movement that we're going to be looking at tomorrow, where we're going to create the nation of Israel, carving it out of a chunk of the Middle East called Palestine. So this country's been around since the 1940s, and it's been a problem since that time because their neighbors are not thrilled that we have people who are Jewish living in this area that is heavily dominated by people who are Arabs, Muslims, and they're frustrated by what's happening there. For many people, they also see this as a colonization effort, where in this area in the Middle East that's trying to be nationalistic, you've got a pocket of former European people who are friendly to the United States. And so Israel is seen with a lot of hostility. They're going to get attacked repeatedly throughout the 1950s and 1960s, and then when those attacks fail, we're going to face two oil shocks from OPEC, O-P-E-C. The oil-producing and exporting countries are going to cut off our oil supply twice, once during Nixon's presidency, once during Carter's presidency, and they're going to demonstrate we really badly need oil for our gigantic military, and they bring us pretty heavily down into stagflation and crisis as a result of what they're doing to us. It's going to spark attempts at creating a national energy policy, but the policy that we were working on back then is still your debate nowadays. For conservatives, their argument was we're a society based on oil, and so we should be doing more drilling here inside of our country. For liberals, their answer is why don't we try out some new ideas like solar or wind or nuclear, and that divide is going to split our country through the 70s all the way to present about what our energy future should be. 8.2. New movements for civil rights occurred during this time period. So this page, the 79, this is totally your civil rights page. This is where you've got your civil rights worksheets. That grid that we built up in class, it's going to help you crush this page. And for you guys, I'm excited because easily, when you think about essay questions throughout U.S. history, it's going to be really hard for me to imagine them not having some portion of the AP task devoted to something that happened to African Americans. And it's been pretty foundational. This is either your synthesis or your actual essay. So this part, talking about how they're fulfilling Reconstruction era promises, many people refer to the 50s and 60s as being the second era of Reconstruction, where they actually accomplished what they weren't able to do back in the 1860s. Civil rights leaders and activists and political leaders achieved some legal and political success in ending segregation, although progress towards racial equality was slow. De jure, de facto. De facto is racial equality. That's going to be slow. We're still working towards it. But ending these barriers for segregation, that's de jure segregation, and so we've given you the terms to be able to knock out this entire page. For letter A, let me run through a laundry list of the people. It says here, during and after the Civil War, there were civil rights leaders who combated racial discrimination, utilizing a variety of strategies, including legal tactics, direct action, and nonviolent protest tactics. That's why I had you do cause and effect for that chart. It will help you crush this box. So let's start at the beginning with this box. First name that you should have here is A. Philip Randolph. During World War II, he's the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He's also influential in CORE. And he points out to Roosevelt, black people are now voting for Roosevelt, not for Republicans, the party of Lincoln. They've now switched. But he also points out there's segregation in the war industries. And Roosevelt's response is, gosh, what can I do? I'm going to really lose it in the South if I start getting aggressive. Eleanor puts pressure on him, but that's still not working. And finally, A. Philip Randolph tells him, if you want to mess, we're going to have a march on Washington, and it's going to shut down that area, and it's going to show that we're not on the same team with you unless you do something. So the connection with A. Philip Randolph is he helps Roosevelt create the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC. The Fair Employment Practices Committee bans segregation in war industries that are getting contracts from the United States government. So it's the first step in ending segregation inside business. It's a tiny one, but it's something. Remember that Truman is going to desegregate the military. Jackie Robinson will then desegregate Major League Baseball. So you have two instances where we have advancement going on. But the rest of our groups, remember next, the NAACP with their triple strategy. They're going to argue, fine, let's keep Plessy versus Ferguson, but they're going to show courtrooms, number one, things in the South aren't equal. Number two, they're going to show it to the courts, nothing's being done to make them equal after a court case that points that out. And then number three, they're going to say then you can't segregate. And this is going to lead you to Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. So NAACP is working legally, and they're famous for the Brown case, most importantly. Remember the SCLC, that's Martin Luther King's group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Most notably, they started off the Montgomery bus boycott, and then obviously they were influential throughout your civil rights movement. SNCC and CORE are going to be huge in the late 1950s by starting their sit-ins. That's John Lewis, who's going to be important in that group, and in 1960 he starts the sit-ins, and then throughout the 60s, you guys remember that cause and effect, freedom rides. James Meredith in Mississippi pushing JFK towards the Civil Rights Act with his March on Washington. Martin Luther King's able to put pressure on. JFK dies. And then you have the Civil Rights Act of 64, Selma, Freedom Summer. Be working that cause and effect. These are the boxes that will allow you to do that. Your next section talks about how the three branches of government used measures to desegregate. Brown versus People Board of Education. You have Civil Rights Act in 57. And another one in 64. The one in 57 was LBJ's. Did a little bit, but not a ton. 64 is the one that ends segregation and discrimination for everybody, including women.
Wait, 1957 is LBJ's Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, so he was in Congress. He's able to push it through during Eisenhower's presidency. And what it did was it created a study on the KKK and said that the government could step in if the voting laws were being broken. Right. You also have a Voting Rights Act that's being created right here. But this final box is showing you that we're going to face massive resistance in the United States. There's debates among civil rights activists, Black Panthers, Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, who want to become more militant. And that discussion is happening right here where we've ended de jure segregation. We're moving into de facto. On your next page, there's a reason why they have the pages set up the way that they do. Your remaining civil rights movements in the 60s are being influenced by Martin Luther King and his strategies. So in this box, feminists and gay and lesbian activists are mobilizing behind their claims. So with the feminists, I'd like to lay out a few different ideas that you should be thinking about. Think about the Civil Rights Act of 64. And this is where I need to apologize to Nassim because this is where I always make my mistakes year after year. She asked me about Title VII during the Civil Rights Act. That's the one that actually is explicit about what discrimination is not allowed.
Yeah.
Title IX is the other thing that should go into this box. That's coming from the Education Amendments of 1973. So they add on to an education law, and Title IX is an amendment that says you must offer women equal opportunities in school, in the classroom, in accommodations, in activities. So the reason why your sports have to be equal men and women because of the law that's created there, because it's been so segregated. So I always end up conflating the two when I hear title.
Yeah, they're kind of similar.
They are similar, but I want to make sure I caught that because you were good. Go ahead.
Title VII is about what?
Title VII is in the Civil Rights Act of 64 that says you can't discriminate based on race, religion, ethnicity, or gender. And then Title IX from the Education Amendments of 73 are going to be about equal educational opportunities for men and women.
What about football?
What about football?
There isn't a girls' football.
Yeah.
You can, but the way that Title IX works is instead of being like a men and women's football team, instead what they take a look at is numbers of participants in sports, so that you've got equal opportunities for men and women to be able to participate in an equal number of activities, even though if it's not going to be straight line, like you're not having a women's football team, you might have a women's sport that then comes in and has the numbers to make up for that difference. Yes. Yeah, and if you watch the news every single year, there's always the story of a young woman your age who comes in and might be like a kicker, running back, something like that, because they were really good in Little League. And so that's always the story every year.
So Title IX is not for the Civil Rights Act?
No, that was my mistake. 1973. Today we broke apart the Latino movement. Remember Cesar Chavez and his great boycott. He's going to be trying to protest for migrant workers. The American Indian movement is known as AIM, American Indian Movement, AIM. And in the American Indian movement, what they're going to get is they're going to get a rethinking of reservation strategies. So in the 1960s, LBJ is going to redo that agreement so that now Native Americans are seen as a nation within a nation. And they're given limited sovereignty where there are some American laws they don't need to obey, and some they do based on treaties. So they've got a different relationship that unwinds what was going on with the Dawes Act from the late 1800s. Yeah.
Oh, didn't that happen in the Down Severalty Act? Isn't that what exactly happened?
The Dawes Severalty Act essentially made them homesteaders and then took away the rest of their land. This is trying to make up for that and renew the put in place what treaties they can still put in place in spite of what changes have happened. So it's the reason why when you go to Mystic Lake, they can run a casino, but other places in the state can't. It's because of the treaties that they've signed with them. Asian Americans, we're going to redo the Immigration Acts in 1965. So you want to be able to talk about the Immigration Act of 65 where we get rid of the quotas from the 1920s. And especially this is going to aid Asian immigrants coming to our country because of the fact that they are especially fleeing Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. We've got Hmong people who have been helping us out in the Vietnam War. They'll come over in large numbers. Many people start pointing out poverty as an issue. Martin Luther King is going to be huge for that. He's going to shift his message to go into that as well. And this is also Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. So being able to talk about that specifically is what they're coding you to. Environmentally, we have a lot of regulations that are being created by both liberal and conservative people to try to deal with the problems of the time. And so the two big things here, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. It's a book written in the 1960s about a pesticide called DDT that is killing insects, but also it's affecting the food chain. So when the insects are eaten by rodents and the rodents are eaten by raptors, the raptors are then eating this pesticide that's causing birth defects that leaves their shells too weak to be able to hold the weight of the birds. So the birds are giving birth to eggs, they then sit down on them, and then they crush the eggs. And so we are on the verge of having our eagles, hawks, falcons, condors, all those critters were almost dead. And so we cut out the DDT, but only because her book brought this to light. Yeah?
What is that book called?
Silent Spring. And they call it that because when they drop this pesticide, you'd have this field that would be chirping with all these bugs and whatever, and then it would just be done. There'd be no noise coming out of the thing because it eradicates everything. EPA, created by Richard Nixon, is key. Clean Water Act, Pure Air Act, other acts, they're Endangered Species Acts, they're coming out of Nixon's time when this environmentalism movement is coming. Earth Day is created in 1970. We just had this past Saturday. Hopefully you celebrated by doing something friendly to Earth. Next page. Liberalism is going to influence post-war politics, and increasingly it's going to come under attack from two different groups. So when it talks about being liberalism at its peak, the peak of liberalism between World War II and now is LBJ. This box is all about LBJ right here, and then it's going to start declining because it's going to come under attack from both conservatives and more radical voices who are going to be angry at it for two different reasons. Conservatives think it goes too far, radicals don't think it goes far enough. So in this box down here, you'll want to be able to run through your Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, food stamps, Head Start, public television. Your laundry list of LBJ programs that we looked at in class should go right here. You should also be able to discuss decisions from the Warren Court and the Berger Court in this box as well, like the Miranda cases for people who are accused of criminal actions, Engel versus Vitale, the court case that separated religion from schools, where they used to make you do school prayers before school got started. They decided that was not a justifiable thing with the separation of church and state. And then the Berger Court, Roe versus Wade, Griswold versus Connecticut, and other sorts of court cases are key for this box right here too. In the 1960s, conservatives, though, are going to challenge liberal laws and court decisions because they're going to point out that we're slipping morally. So let me give you some names for this box right here for people who are attacking the government during the 1960s. Barry Goldwater, George Wallace, we just saw today at 68 getting 10 million votes. This is going to lead to the Southern strategy where Nixon is going to become more conservative, try to support those individuals. And tomorrow we're going to take a look at an economist named Milton Friedman, who is going to become for the Republicans what John Maynard Keynes was for the Democrats, where he's going to argue that our biggest problem is the government, that we have too many taxes, too many regulations, it makes a mess out of the economy, so he's going to argue we need to go in a more conservative direction. Another split is going to happen right here. Some groups on the left also reject liberal policies, arguing that LBJ is not going far enough. Whether it's going to be Black Panthers arguing that civil rights doesn't go far enough. The anti-war protesters who see LBJ as a killer of people rather than somebody who's engaging in world peace. Radicals like hippies who feel like the civil rights movement and the poverty movements aren't doing enough. And then public confidence here is going to get shaken, and trust in government's going to happen, because over here, you need a certain number of terms. When they talk about economic challenges in the 70s, this is stagflation. We're going to talk about it tomorrow. A weird economic thing that happens where our economy dips. But because of the oil shocks, our prices for everything goes through the roof, so when you lose your job, and suddenly everything becomes more expensive. It's a double whammy. And for people in America who thought we were on top of everything, they now feel like we're slipping. When it comes to political scandals, credibility gap. People don't trust the JFK assassination happened the way that it did. They feel like the government's always lying to them, like with the U-2 spy plane incident. They feel betrayed by the Gulf of Tonkin in the way that LBJ has been fighting the war. And then Nixon, obviously, with Watergate and his scandals is going to bring the same thing. And then we have foreign policy crises. Vietnam going badly. OPEC, where we can't get our oil anymore and Middle Eastern countries are dominating us, is going to divide us. And then your last box, there's a battle in a culture war over social issues. Sexuality, whether it's LGBT, abortion, birth control, religion in our society, crime, law and order, drugs, all of those things end up dividing our country. The idea of the power of the federal government, is it too big after LBJ? Race divides people. Remember the battle over affirmative action, and some people calling that reverse racism against white people because the people being picked on for not getting spots. And there's many people who are talking about more individual rights and weakening the government. So the states' rights movement belongs here as well, which is a big George Wallace and Richard Nixon idea. Your next page is really simple. Hey, Max.
Explain Medicare and Medicaid.
Medicare is the health insurance program created by LBJ to give health insurance to old people because we tie our insurance to work. They didn't have any. Medicaid is health insurance for poor people and disabled people. Your next section, we have a booming economy after World War II. Huge private sector, so we're going to have a big boom when it comes to both private manufacturing of stuff that we want, like cars, TVs, other sorts of appliances that make people's lives better. Remember also we massively increase military spending, which is what saved us from the Great Depression and World War II. So we're going to see that continue in our Cold War, where we have the stimulus of war spending. Because everybody's having babies, you now have more people in our society. We need to buy more baby stuff for them, and then they'll grow up. And then we have tons of new innovations that are happening. We also have people moving to the suburbs so that they can find opportunities like we see in this box. We also have internal migration. So in this box, remember the term Rust Belt to Sun Belt. Remember also the documentaries I had you think about from Crash Course yesterday, those globalizations ones? They're really good for this box to describe that we're moving from Rust Belt to Sun Belt, and then from Sun Belt outside the country, which is another trend for this theory now.
With the suburbs, what was the town called when all of us were?
Yeah, Levittown. If we move down here, immigration from around the world is going to boom. So make sure you know the Immigration Act of 1965. It's also controversial for a couple different reasons. It's bringing in immigrants from different parts of the world who don't look like traditional nativistic people from the 1800s. Specifically, they're coming from Latin American countries, they're coming from Asia, they're coming from Africa, which is going to cause more cultural diversity. You also have during this time period laws that are put into place where if you come to this country, you can then bring in your family, which is going to cause a lot of familial movement. And we're going to see waves of refugees coming in from war, especially Cambodian, Laotian, Hmong, Vietnamese, who are seeking aid here because they're fleeing bad conditions overseas. Go ahead, Melissa.
Didn't this also have restrictions for first time on Western?
So it's going to be putting different sorts of rules on different places around the world. And so it does give the American government the ability to limit who's coming in. So yeah, definitely. It's very much tweaking where people can come from. You're spot on. Final page. So we have new demographic and social developments, think baby boom, counterculture, along with anxieties about the Cold War that changed our country. Number one, we end up with a mass culture. Whenever you call up a phone hotline and you get somebody answering who is in a telemarketing job, a lot of times they hire people from Kansas, Nebraska, because they have a neutral accent, although all of our accents are more diminished than they used to be. So it used to be that we had really, really bad accents throughout the country, but now that we've got TV, we've got movies, we're becoming more homogenous in our culture, in our language, in all of that sort of stuff. Although if you do travel to the South, be prepared to be made fun of every summer when I travel places. They're like, "You're not from around here." I'm like, "What are you talking about? I'm Minnesotan." What is it? They can hear it immediately when you talk to them. So we're gonna end up with like rock and roll music, movies, TV, artwork that's gonna be all culturally part of trends that are nationwide. For your artwork also, the trend that you should notice here, and we're not going to spend a ton of time with it because I'd be stunned if you get a lot of it on your test, but this is when we move into modern art and pop art. So this is a transition that we make, and if you're a math and science person, I want to prepare you because I remember when I was in college, I had a professor who showed us this stuff, and I was like, this is crap. A kid in elementary school can make this stuff. Like Jackson Pollock, who took paint and just flipped it at a canvas. Her response was, "Do it," and she gave me all the materials and just let me go. And I was like, "Ah," and she's like, "No, really, if a kid can do it, how about you, big boy, you're 21, let's see." And I realized the lesson, I couldn't. What I was trying to say is, this is not art to me. And what the art world is saying is, they didn't need to be photorealistic anymore. So when you go to like the Walker Art Center, where it's like a gold toilet or something weird like that, they don't need to make a painting how people look because you can just take out your phone and go boom. And so because we can already do that with technology, they're going to take their art in other directions. That's why you see more experimental art forms than what they had previously. For feminists and young people, they're going to engage in the counterculture, and they're going to be rejecting a lot of the conformity of the 1950s, which is why I played for you guys the song Little Boxes that you can cite inside your writing if you would like to. This is your beatnik movement. This is your hippie movement. And a lot of people are trying to break out of those old style of living that they had previously. So there's going to be a culture clash that's happening here. Right here, though, you should notice the counter revolution. So where we have a counter revolution in the 1960s, there are many conservatives who realize they're losing. They are losing to LBJ. The argument in the 1960s of we should help old people was pretty convincing. And so arguing against Medicare because it was helping out old people didn't work. And so the Republicans are going to come up with different strategies, like arguing about debt rather than arguing about moochers becomes pretty easy for them. Arguing about being pro-life rather than being anti-choice is something that works out. So they work on messaging. And for many individuals, religion becomes huge for conservatives because they feel like religiously we're slipping. In fact, some people call this another great awakening in U.S. history, where after we have a huge lurch to the left with like Roe versus Wade, discussions about sexuality and that sort of stuff, you guys can now turn on the TV and find people preaching from mega churches who are very, very strictly conservative on a whole host of religious issues. What they also realize is many of these individuals will use Martin Luther King's ideas to try to reverse what King and other people were doing. So massive protests, framing arguments to get mass appeal, trying to do stuff on TV to demonstrate the rightness of their causes. All of these ideas that made the left so emotionally powerful, the right is now doing too. And the reason why your politics is so nasty is you've got these two very heated, passionate groups using the same tactics, and they keep smashing into each other. And so that's the world that we get to hand out to you guys on all sorts of issues like death penalty, abortion, drugs, gay marriage, and a host of other things. That is period 8. Tomorrow in class we will wrap period 8 for our instruction with Nixon Ford Carter, and we'll start into Reagan, and we'll be able to wrap that next week. The way we started this review session totally is the questions you should be asking right now. Any of those topics you get to where you're not 100% solid, feel free to ask. I would love to talk to you about that. Rachel, I'm still not on board with Kate Cambridge.
Why not?
It's just,
What if I bring the movie into the office? Watch it with your daughter.
Does she even have
American Girl dolls? No.
They're historical dolls. Oh my god.
They're all stuff like adults.
Okay, she has a softball bat. She has
Nice.
You can have both.
she has a volleyball.
Nice.
She has let's see here, an iPod Touch that she could sit around and noodle around on.
What we spend over.
It is?
Yeah.
I did that 2 months ago.
You did.
I forgot about that. Don't turn off our
I
test.
wasn't sure. She
I'll bring
remembers.
it.
No.
Don't turn off our test.
I don't want
Wasn't there something that revealed like there was one time the dogs several times? Or like
Oh, that's a dog plan where they sent over my.
no, the dogs several times like the Indians like where they brought up where they said like like they
If it's just like the Homestead Act, except they used it on Indians, so every person that was like in there.
I'm saying what to the way the dogs like I'm pretty sure I thought I saw something on my flashcards that had that.
So the Dawes Act was amended in 1891, 1898, and 1906. Oh, I know what you're talking about. All right, so it wasn't any of those. For FDR in 1934, he created something called the Indian New Deal. And so I think that may be what you're thinking about. It's called the Indian Reorganization Act.
Yep.
And that's the one where he extended rights to them that had been taken away by the Dawes Act.
Oh, thank
You good?
Yep.
Sweet. Nice work. Hi. Thank you.
That's basically
In one weekend. Do you have flashcards?
Yeah, but they're kind of like not that helpful.
How so?